Hello and good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are in the world, and a warm welcome to our Critical Metals webinar. How can the mining industry urgently fulfill the defense industry's critical raw material requirements? I'm Andrew Thake, Divisional Director for Resourcing Tomorrow, and I'll be your moderator for the webinar. The need for critical raw materials, things like rare earth elements, gallium, germanium, antimony, and titanium, is no longer just an economic issue. It's a fundamental national security and industrial resilience challenge. Our defense sectors rely on these minerals for everything from guided missiles and communication to radar and autonomous systems. Yet the supply chains remain fragmented and often reactive. Our goal today is to move from discussion to actionable strategies for better public-private coordination. I would welcome those joining the webinar that at any time we can take questions from the audience. Please post your questions into the Q&A box. And to join me to go and discuss these issues, I have a distinguished panel. I have Peter Hanley, who is from the Hague Centre for Strategic Studies and European Initiative for Energy Security. I'll also be joined by Chris Beattie, who's the Head of Government Relations and Public Affairs for TechMet. And joining us for the first part of the webinar, we have Nathan Manfield, who is Head of Policy for the ADS Group. Nathan, I'm going to start with you. Let's start with the basics. For those of you who may not be familiar, who are the ADS Group's members, and why is this conversation, the urgent need for critical raw materials, such a vital issue for your members right now?
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks for having me today. And we've been pleased to support with this webinar, as this has been a topic of great interest, as you can imagine, to our members. So we're a UK trade association for the defence, aerospace, security and space sectors. We've got around 1,700 members here in the UK, and that's right from the major defence and aerospace primes that are possibly household names to sort of a couple of innovators working away in the proverbial shed. So from really the top to the bottom of the scale of the supply chain. And in terms of this topic, we've been working closely with the government, this government and the previous one, on the issue of access to critical minerals for some time, and more widely the kind of bucket of supply chain challenges that faces the defence industry in the UK. And as you've just outlined, we're facing, I think, a strategic vulnerability given the reliance on critical raw minerals for advanced platforms, fighter jets, naval systems, precision munitions at a time of global supply chain disruption. So it's not a niche issue, as you've just outlined. It is foundational to our national security and our resilience. And, we have dependencies on a whole bucket of rare earths, things like hafnium, molybdenum. We've got other high-spec metals, and they underpin the stealth, the propulsion, the electronic warfare capabilities that are critical to our strategic sort of edge against our adversaries. The geopolitical risk is acute, and I'm conscious I'm speaking to a very sort of expert audience here, but of course, given the dominance of certain players in this space and the export restrictions that have been imposed targeting defence end users, we're in a new era and a new set of challenges. But we are seeing, from a Western perspective, a response to try a global race, really, to secure supply chains. And I think in the UK, what we've been trying to work with the government to achieve is to that same sense of urgency.
I think that frames the issues and especially the urgency perfectly. And of course, your members, as you outlined, the defence equipment manufacturers, are at the sharp end of this. One of the biggest challenges for miners is, of course, investment confidence, which relies on a clear signal of demand. How effective is the defence industry currently at data sharing and long-term demand forecasting?
Well, that's a great question, because that's probably our number one from a defence industry perspective, let alone for the associated mining industry. Sort of challenge right now. We've had a busy year from a UK perspective at a strategic level. We had something called the Strategic Defence Review published earlier in the summer. We've had a defence industrial strategy. But what we're actually still waiting on is a defence investment plan that defines where the UK will spend its money. So we've got a pathway to go to 3% and then 3.5% over the coming decade of GDP on defence. But what we don't yet know is on what, how many ships or planes or whatever it may be, and when. So that is a challenge for the defence industry, and it's making its own investment plans. And therefore, that is a challenge for supporting sectors that are providing to it to plan your exploration and your processing investments with confidence. And what we've been advocating for some time is a longer term, clearer demand signal, a longer procurement forecast to catalyze private investment. I'd also just say, in terms of the current level of collaboration between the defense sector and critical mineral suppliers, it's going to be limited practically by commercial sensitivities, fragmented data flows. What we have seen is that, I suppose in a good and a bad way, we've had a pretty lively few years recently in learning how to work better, have greater supply chain transparency, learning the lessons from the COVID era in terms of understanding what are your actual sort of pinch points and problems. So hopefully that is something we can build upon as we're in this new era of geopolitical tension as well as more economic factors.
Yeah, and I think probably just building on that, you've talked about obviously what you'd like to hear further from the government, but the practical steps that your members can take to provide that kind of long-term demand signaling that would truly incentivize miners. Can you just probably like elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, no, I mean, look, there is an onus also on defense companies to support with that. So there we have seen members undertake long-term offtake agreements for critical minerals. That's a growing trend we're seeing. I think there's something around supporting joint research and development on advanced recycling and refining technologies. And there's a wider piece which is around ESG frameworks and providing that confidence to de-risk investment when it comes to partnering with defense companies. But government does have a role. We need government backing, whether that is fiscal incentives, whether that is on the international stage in terms of agreements to help diversify supply chains, or regulatory flexibility as well. So that could, for example, relating to what's called the UK REACH regime, so a chemicals regulation regime, but also applies to listed metals. So there are things on both sides that can be done in bringing together the defence and the mining industry more closely, I think.
You mentioned in passing to your last answer, you mentioned in passing ESG. We often talk about the mining side, but we also need to address recoverability and circularity. How can and does the defense industry working with miners better collaborate right at the design phase to improve CRM traceability, recoverability, and closed loop material reuse?
Yeah. I mean, I think that closing the loop on material use is critical because fundamentally the UK does not have available all of the natural resources, even if they could be tapped into to supply all of its needs. So we need to reduce that level of demand and promote greater circularity. So I think there's something around defense companies collaborating with mining firms on traceability systems for verification of origin, investing in advanced recycling technologies for rare earths and rare earth magnets, forgive me, and super alloys, and also designing in at the outset, as you just sort of touched upon there, Andrew, design for recovery principles when we're thinking about new platforms, so that it's not sort of an afterthought as to how we might cover the materials used at an end of life point. And we have, as ADS, as a trade body, advocated to government we need to foster greater refining and recycling capability as part of or capacity, forgive me, as part of a broader circular economy.
Sure. And are we seeing collaboration happening early enough in this product cycle?
I think it's patchy in terms of the engagement we have with our members. Clearly, the larger players that we have, the primes that I mentioned, are leading the way in many cases and taking greater ownership of meeting their future demand and creating a buffer against geopolitical and supply chain shocks. That's not necessarily quite percolated down through the supply chain. One thing I'd say is a limiting factor for the defense sector is very strict technical standards. And so that often limits substitution and recycling. It could create a certain degree of rigidity. And we've presented that issue to the government. I think it's an ongoing conversation because we cannot easily dual source or change suppliers all the time because it's specified you must have X from Y. And also on the international partnership side, I think that is an essential part of pooling resources and sharing processing capacity. So it doesn't just sit on the UK defence sector or the UK government alone to try and build greater resilience in this space.
Sure. I'm going to ask you a few more questions, but if there are questions from the audience for Nathan, then please write them in the chat box. In terms of defence specifications, what about defence specifications and requests for international collaboration that you've made in representations to the MOD?
Yeah, so I mean, it's sort of just building on what I just said. There's in terms of defense as a customer, because bear in mind the defense market is composed of a monopsony model. Government is the customer. I mean, there are overseas customers from an export perspective, but government defines everything in terms of the rules around that. And necessarily, given it is safety critical, what defense companies produce for our armed forces, they have very strict standards, and we would not want to see any deviation from that. But it does mean that when there is a pinch point from a supply perspective, as we've seen a few times in recent years, you can't easily say, well, actually, I'm going to stop getting my source from Australia, let's say, I'm going to go elsewhere in Asia, because maybe there are certain, in terms of the technical specifications that have been put in place, they put limits on substitution of materials. So it's an ongoing dialogue. We worked as part of a task and finish group with the previous government on critical minerals, and there is an upcoming critical mineral strategy refresh in the works with this government that we've been contributing to. So we hope to see greater flexibility, but it's one of those classic conundrums of coordinating across government between the Ministry of Defence here in the UK, Department for Business and Trade, Department for Environment, and others to all get on the same page.
Sure. Thank you for that. What I'm going to do is I'm certainly now going to just have you on the line now for another 3 or 4 minutes, but now also Sagan and bring in Chris Beattie and Peter Hanley as well. But perhaps maybe you can turn to yourself first, Peter. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on what Nathan said, or whether you had a specific question for Nathan.
Well, yes. I mean, because there's an association which is very similar to ADS in Europe. It's actually got the same initials another way around, ASD. And I've been engaging with them recently to get this discussion going about are they thinking seriously about security of supply for the raw materials? Are they thinking about it in a value chain sense? Are they trying to eliminate foreign entities of concern from the supply chain in the same very sort of robust way that the Americans are? And, you know, is there cooperation between the UK and the European Union when it comes to getting the materials and getting the processing facilities and other things in place to actually be able to stand more on our own 2 feet, because we cannot rely in the same way as we could on the Americans being there for everything we needed going forward. And we have a real threat on our doorstep from Russia. That's a real and urgent threat.
I think it's a great question, Peter. Yes, we are actually members of ASD, partners to them. And actually, off the back of the UK-EU reset earlier this year in May, when a deal was reached for a sort of deeper partnership, we actually hosted the ASD convention here in London, which I think was a sign of a changing politics from recent years. And it's certainly something we're engaging with ASD, trying to feed in what the UK approach is in thinking about security of supply issues. To be fair, the EU has stolen a march in some of these areas. I think there's something also for the UK in learning from how the EU is approaching economic security as a kind of broader concept. But from our perspective, we continue to seek closer ties, and we're not trying to rewind history, but a closer partnership. We've been feeding into negotiations about UK association on particular EU defence initiatives. But as part of that, security of supply has to be a consideration, a material part of that. Pooling, I think, I spoke about earlier. We need to pool our resources and also our kind of buying power overseas if we're going to, as well as developing our own processing and refining capabilities at home, if we're going to get a good deal in what is basically a bit of a knife fight on the global stage. So yeah, I totally agree.
Thank you very much for that, Nathan. I know that you now have to go and jump off. So I just wanted to thank you so much for setting the stage for us on the critical importance of this topic to the defence supply chain. We really deeply appreciate your insights. Thank you very much for your time, Nathan.
All right, thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Staying on the call with Chris Beattie and Peter Hanley. It's a question for both of you, but I'll probably ask Chris to answer it first, followed by Peter. Both of you've got a deep understanding of policy and strategy, we often hear about major proposals, such as the proposed 5% NATO allocation of defense budgets to critical minerals. In your view, how crucial is the role of government defense budgets and public-private partnerships? Perhaps I can go to yourself first, Chris, and perhaps in it you can explain a little bit about your background and who TechMet are.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me, Andrew. I'm Chris Beatty. I'm the head of government relations and public affairs for TechMet. TechMet is a critical minerals investment company. We are an EU company. We're domiciled in Ireland. We're also partially owned by the US government. And our role is building more resilient and independent supply chains for the critical minerals that are currently dominated by China. And that's exactly why, to your question, we feel it's important that the government play a role in these supply chains. China dominates, anywhere from 65 to 99% of the supply chains for some of these critical minerals. And that means they get to decide who participates in key aspects of our economy and key aspects of defense industry supply chains. And that's no longer, that's sustainable. So because they have the ability to deploy these minerals as they see fit or restrict these minerals as they see fit, or to change the prices of these minerals, making new production and processing capacity being economic or uneconomic, there's a role for governments to come in and help fund these projects and make sure that their nations have access to the materials that they need for their defense sector. So for example, in the EU, I believe the EU is 99% reliant on the 17 rare earths required and 98% reliant on rare earth permanent magnets. That is simply terrifying from a defense perspective, and I'd be very interested in Peter's perspective on that as well.
Peter, what are your thoughts?
Well, I agree with what Nathan said before and with what Chris has just said now. I mean, clearly, when you talk about defense, you're talking about a sovereign function, and that is largely at the level of individual countries. But in the case of Europe, there is this collective work, both in the European Union and together with the UK and the US and others in NATO. So both the European Union as a body and NATO are working much closer together than they have in the past on all of these issues relating to supply chains, material readiness, the defense industrial base, and procurement. This procurement is one of the angles where the European toolkit is quite ready to jump in and do these kind of procurements at the European level. But clearly, while there's a role for government, there has to be a lot more readiness by defense primes and their suppliers to wake up to these issues, to do wargaming about the kind of supply chain disruptions that can be expected if someone turns off the tap. Oh, actually, China did turn off the tap at least twice this year for a range of defense-related materials. So you don't have to hypothesize. You have to take the realities and work out what's your survival plan. How are you going to source materials on your own or with the help of others if your ability to build and replenish your defense equipment is hurt by a hostile party?
And just a follow-up question for you, Peter, that's appeared in the chat box from Peter Flory. It's what's the best way to coordinate EU and NATO approaches, including NATO plans to spend some of the 1.5% of GDP on defense-related spending pledged at the Hague Summit on CRM supply chains?
Well, Peter's a colleague of mine at the at SAFE and the EIES, so maybe he should answer the question as he's a former senior official at NATO himself. So I think he's putting me on the spot here, but I think we need to have good operational working groups where the right people come together. I've seen so often in the past that when you try to get industrial cooperation, you get the procurement people in the room who are mandated to look for the cheapest, easiest solutions and to commoditize everything. Well, what you really need is senior strategic thinkers inside companies who are prepared to think about risk in a much more geopolitical way and think about possible solutions which go outside of the normal toolkit. NATO needs to do this very robustly in terms of how adequate is our industrial production facilities, how vulnerable are they to attack, how easy are they to rebuild if they are damaged, and the European Union needs to be bringing in, if you like, the whole of the regular non-defense economy, without which you can it's very difficult to get the business case for projects, whether it's a mining project or a refining project. It's very difficult to get the business case just with the defense demand on its own, because the defense demand is niche and strategic, but not big enough to actually put the lots of money on the table to build a new facility.
And then I guess a question for like both of you. I might just go to sort of like Chris first. What sort of funding is available from the US government? Because it obviously seems to be that there's like a variety of different sort of like investment arms of the US government. There's US Exim, there's the Department of War, there's the Department of Energy, there's the OSC, and there's also, I guess, yourselves as TechMet, they obviously have like a relationship with the US government. And then likewise, in the same question for yourself, Peter, because certainly when I was over at or rather the EIT conference in May, there was lots of different talks about defense funds being set up, and I'm not too sure where we are sort of like now in November 2025. But maybe I can go to yourself first, Chris.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think that's one area where the U.S. government has been very exciting and innovative this year, in addition to the traditional sources of funding at the Department of Energy, Exim Bank, as you mentioned, Development Finance Corporation, which has deployed 3 equity investments into TechMet since 2020, as well as DOW, which has not only the Office of Strategic Capital, but also manages the Defense Logistics Agency and just got another $7.5 billion in the OBBB. Which is a significant ramp up from their past funding in terms of a multiple of, I believe, 7. So the U.S. is deploying a variety of different funding mechanisms that cover everything from R&D to equity investments, to debt, to pricing support. Everybody watching this will be familiar with the MP Materials deal, and every company in the space wants their own MP Materials deal. Whether or not that's feasible is certainly up for debate. But what we're excited about is that the U.S. government has clearly woken up to this being a major national security issue and is responding in kind. That is an area where I feel that Europe hasn't quite responded yet. The CRMA is certainly a step forward. I think the EU has been good at setting kind of benchmarks and writing reports, but not so good at deploying capital in meaningful ways. And as we're talking about, all of securing these supply chains will require new production and processing capacity. We have to stand up new projects. In order to do that, we have to make them economic in order to crowd in additional private sector investment. And we feel that's exactly what the US government is looking to do with these investments, is not just sole source and things, but to serve as a bridge for additional private sector capital, make these projects economic, and then bring new capacity online so that we can diversify our sources for these materials.
Peter?
Yeah, I was just thinking back to a few days ago when President Trump met President Xi, and they agreed on a truce in relation to the really tough export controls that China introduced in October. I mean, very, very strong controls, which would basically turn off the supply tap to the whole world for all the things that go into the defense sector. Now, there's a 1-year sort of truce. And I quite like the remark that was made afterwards by Treasury Secretary Besant. He said, we are going to move as the United States at warp speed to get our house in order. And that's what Europe needs to do as well. And I think I would agree with criticisms about the slow nature of the bureaucratic machine in Brussels. I used to be part of it myself, so I can accept that criticism. But just a few days ago, there was a very interesting speech made by Commission President Ursula von der Leyen in Berlin. And she basically said, we cannot carry on doing things the way we're doing them here in Europe. We have to be much more agile and move at scale, because we're really under threat. And she said what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the critical raw materials, because we've seen just how exposed we are there, and we're going to adopt a much more aggressive approach, doing everything we can to secure the supply of raw materials, particularly for our security. And she started off by saying, let's look at what's already in the European economy and really get our heads around the recovery and recycling of things. If you just take a ship, for example, or a end-of-life fighter aircraft or civil aircraft, it contains a huge amount of stuff that probably came in originally from China, but it's now in Europe's economy, and that should be a good starting point for ramping up speedy identification of things that can go straight back into making new defense equipment. But she also referred to the investment challenge, where she knows that we haven't been fast or ambitious enough, and also to strategic stockpiling, demand aggregation, collective purchasing, all of these things. So this is coming sometime pretty soon before Christmas. I do detect a very strong degree of urgency on the part of the European Commission at this particular juncture.
Another question from the audience. Defense is a very small buyer of CRMs in terms of volume. Can the defense sector, government plus industry, on their own secure CRM supply chains? Can hypothetical defense-only requirements for friend sourcing generate enough volumes to create a business case for setting up alternative supply chains for any of the CRMs we are dependent on? Who would like to tackle that first? Peter or Chris?
Chris, you go first, Chris. It's more of a business case question.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I think there's certainly a role for the defense sector. It's important because obviously defense budgets are significant. They play a role in managing stockpiles, but also they, as Peter said, they manage significant inventories of materials. So they're a player in all of these markets, and we should differentiate that. The market for lithium is much different than the market for gallium. So not only in terms of size, but in terms of use and in terms of business case. So I think there's a role for the defense sector to play. However, they can't do it on their own. It's under the stockpiling case, which I think we'll talk about a little bit later on, serving as an off-taker, potentially of last resort, or working in concert with the markets to provide some price support. That is very helpful in terms of developing new projects. But I don't believe that the defense sector can do this entirely on their own.
And I think I already said the same thing in a previous intervention. I do not think the defense sector on its own can secure the supplies of critical raw materials that it needs. There may be a few exceptions when you're talking about something where the global consumption is maybe 100 tons of something a year. Some of these niche things like, I don't know, beryllium or whatever it might be. For those things, you can actually have, let's say, a Department of War or NATO or the European Union jumping on an asset and say, that's not Chinese controlled. We will lock that in through some kind of investment / strategic stockpiling and be sure it's there for us, not necessarily us in isolation as Europe. It can be the like-minded countries or the allies who collectively take over the future supply of a key asset. I mean, just in the last few weeks, for example, on the back of the deal that was struck between the US and Australia, the strategic partnership on critical minerals, it was all deal-based. And one of the deals was a scandium project in Australia, owned by Sunrise Energy Minerals, I believe, where the deal was Lockheed will take a long-term 25% offtake of the scandium. And scandium is almost essentially completely controlled by China at the moment. So that's a really interesting move. I would like to see the European defense sector make a similar move on scandium or tungsten or antimony or whatever it might be, because there are things out there. But I think the defense sector can show the way. This is really important. But then you need to bring in other people who have the offtake needs to make it a big enough package for engagement.
And I think that pretty sort of nicely segues into the next question. Chris, from an investment and supply security perspective at TechMet, how do you view the role of critical minerals stockpiling as an urgent measure to shore up national security? And what are the practical hurdles for implementing an effective national stockpile?
So, as I just mentioned, I do think it's part of a solution, but it's in no way a silver bullet. I mean, it'll play a role in providing offtakes and pricing support. However, it is incredibly challenging. And since the late 90s, early 2000s, the US government has sold down most of their critical materials stockpiles, so they have to build it back up. That is a giant organization that requires additional people, additional budget, which they got some in the OBBB. But also all these materials are different. Their storage requirements are different. The forms in which they're stored are different. how they track pricing and sell down or buy in needs to be managed very closely. So I think stockpiling plays a major role, but I worry that it's in the policy space, it's taken almost this silver bullet mentality of, oh yes, this will solve all of our problems and we'll just begin stockpiling and we'll be ready. I think it's a role, but it needs to be done in concert with things that we mentioned, providing equity investments to earlier stage projects, debt support, R&D support, additional grants, pricing support, et cetera. So it's part of a solution, not a whole of a solution.
Another policy challenge is, of course, permitting. You've just had a question popped into the Q&A box. So I'm going to direct this to you, Peter, but by all means, please add on to the previous comments that Chris has made about stockpiling. But the question from the audience is, permitting requirements are a major obstacle to CRM and a variety of capital investments in both Europe and the US. There's a lot of effort going into resolving this challenge, especially for priority projects, but there's also a pushback. How do you see this debate proceeding? Are defence requirements a meaningful political driver in this debate, or is the main impetus coming from clean energy and grid requirements?
So I'll park that, and I would like to add onto the stockpiling first. So one thing I'd like to remind you of is that in its export controls, China has been very, very clear that it will not give any export licenses for things that are going into the defense sector or for purposes of strategic stockpiling. The last thing it wants is to lose its leverage by releasing materials which will help others to reduce their dependencies on China. It wants to keep that, ability to squeeze its adversaries whenever it wishes. But we shouldn't be taken in by that. So I think we do have to look at a complete toolkit. And I agree with Chris, strategic stockpiling sounds very attractive, but you just have to look at those who've been doing it over the decades to know that it's not easy. The Americans, they did it well immediately after the Second World War. They've dropped off a lot since the 1980s. The Japanese do it pretty well. I believe that JOGMEC is pretty competent in terms of the strategic stockpiling, and it knows what it's doing for the purposes of the Japanese industrial complex. Europe has not got much experience of this, with the exception of some of the former Soviet bloc members who did it and probably still have the DNA of strategic stockpiling. So this is something which we can do, but I don't see it as just a buffer against supply chain disruption. I see it as a potential element in building the investment case for projects. Because if you go in and say, well, look, here's an asset, we have immediate needs for these amounts, but we can also create, we can invest in a strategic stockpile, which can also then help to attract the necessary private investment and public funding to make a mining or a refining project viable. Now, when it comes to the permitting, this is a problem everywhere. It's a problem in the US, it's a problem in Europe. We've tried to tackle this in Europe through regulatory measures, instances being the Critical Raw Materials Act, the Net Zero Industry Act, but also when we faced the first energy crisis after COVID, there was a massive shortcutting of all the permitting to get renewable energy off the ground and other forms of energy much faster than before. And I think in the case of Germany, I think they managed to get an LNG terminal approved, permitted in 3 months. It shows you can do stuff when your back's against the wall. I think the key thing here is recognizing whether your back is to the wall and then making sure that you don't throw away all the safeguards and protections, but you just find much more coherent, strategic, prioritized ways of getting things permitted when they have been identified as being of strategic importance for Europe or for the United States or whatever it might be.
Chris, I think I'm right in saying that on average it takes a project to get, I think, 17.2 years to get from exploration to production along the Lassonde curve. And I think I'm right in saying, but Chris, you're going to correct me if I'm wrong on this, that the US, especially when it comes to projects that are on public land as opposed to private land, has a very, very poor record at sort of like getting those projects from exploration to production. Do you see it changing under the current administration? And if so, how?
Yes, absolutely. And I do believe you're right. Those stats are somewhat disputed because it includes mining, and then you have to consider that mining versus processing. And I believe the U.S. is second only to Zambia in the world, which is an impressive record there. But I do think that'll change significantly. And I think one of the challenges, both in the US and in Europe, is that the regulatory frameworks are very, very complex. It is in the US, it's the state laws versus the federal laws. In the EU, it's each member state, I imagine, has their own regulatory problems. I think this administration is looking to move as quickly as possible by using the defense sector in particular and looking at what they can do on federal lands, which might not require the same processes that states will require. And in general, when you identify something as an area of national security, or you can declare a national security emergency, that will certainly streamline things in the short term. In the long term, we will just have to look at the frameworks that exist both in the US and Europe, how litigation can tie up projects for years in ways that is really counterproductive. I mean, we have to, each project should be judged on its own merits and should be compliant with all the required laws, but shouldn't be allowed to be tied up in courts for years and years just for litigation purposes by activist groups. So I think there are very important issues that have become structural problems, not necessarily operational problems, and we need to make sure that we are rewriting these regulations that are fit for purpose and that are appropriately designed to address the national security concerns of these member states. Peter, I'd be interested in hearing more about what the EU regulations are, but I would also note on the Chinese restrictions, it's not just the materials either, it's the equipment that is a major concern, the equipment and the expertise, which will be key as Europe looks to, I hope, invest more in the midstream processing areas as well.
So I just add on the permitting. So there is one thing which is relevant here. It's very hard to shortcut the geological work and all the kind of technical work about a project. So all the things about permitting, they kick in as part of a complex process. So the key thing about the permitting is, as far as European regulation is concerned, it's once you're ready technically, once you've done your preliminary feasibility study and all this kind of thing, once you've done your environmental impact assessments, once your dossier is ready, if your project has chosen to be a European strategic project, then a mining project will get its permitting, will get its permits to operate within 27 months from the submission of the full dossier. There'll be a single point of contact in the public administration whose job is to push it along and engage with the project promoter, and it will be treated as a matter of national priority. The deadline for industrial facilities, which is the case for refining and recycling, is shorter. I think we proposed originally 12 and it came out at 15 or 17. But anyway, the idea is that you have a guarantee of getting an answer much faster than you would under a status quo situation. And I think that's one aspect. Another aspect is making sure that the permitting authorities are all working on the same page, because you do have different levels. You have the European, the national, the subnational. And at the end of the day, it's about people's expertise. And I would like to see that people who do permitting are aware of the new technologies and processes that you use, because quite often they're not aware of things which are going to make the whole mining and refining processes more innovative, less environmentally damaging than the methods that they're familiar with.
Thank you very much for that, Peter. We've got just over 5 minutes left for the webinar, so I just want to quickly just pivot to technology, but I'd still welcome any sort of further questions from the audience. Obviously, the need for speed is a real, as both of you have got highlighted. What about leveraging AI for defense requirements? How can the industry benefit from that? How can we use AI? Maybe if I start with yourself first, Chris.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have some of the same fears about the use of AI to solve our critical raw materials problems as I do as the use of stockpiling, because people look to it to solve all of the world's problems overnight. I don't think that's going to happen. I think mining is still very technically challenging, and as is processing, and it's going to take a while for AI to have an impact. And I think perhaps AI's largest impact might be as a demand driver, and it's going to drive demand for all these materials up higher and higher. But I do think it can certainly play a role in advancing technologies much faster and leveling the playing field in terms of how these technological applications are available to more states, member states of the EU and the US as well. So I would caution against AI being deployed as a savior for the industry. I know the Department of War, for example, has a DARPA program that is working to deploy AI to help predict some pricing mechanisms and things, which is a unique application and could be very helpful for the use of stockpiling and offtake agreements that the US government is looking to deploy. But I still think we have to get the material out of the ground. I still think we have to learn how to refine it and process it. And we have to build, permanent rare earth magnets as well.
I think, well, I agree with Chris. I also share a fear that AI is so capital rich, it's going to cannibalize all other needs for raw materials, whether it's the energy transition or defense. It's got the deepest pockets to acquire assets more than anyone else. The other thing I would like to say about defense is we need to sort of stop thinking exclusively about big things that take years to build, like ships and aircraft. I was at a conference in Hamburg organized by IISS just a week or two ago with lots of defense people, and it's all about agility in designing solutions that can be used in all theaters very, very fast. Innovation cycles that come down from years, not to months, but to days, weeks and days in some cases, as we've seen in Ukraine. And that means a lot more innovative use of materials, workarounds. If you can't get material X, maybe you need to, what Nathan was saying, you need to relax a little bit some of the pure technical specifications. As long as something functions and is safe, maybe you should be looking for substitution to make sure things work, but be much more agile.
And that actually probably leads into my final question. I mean, the question I'd written down was actually more to do with procurement timing. And the question I'd written down was, are there models from the energy sector or elsewhere that the defense industry could adopt to provide long-term procurement contracts that are crucial for the 5 to 10 timelines that we need for the horizons of a new mining project? But you can either choose to answer that question, Peter and Chris, or you can just choose to answer like a slightly different question. What can we learn from other industries that we can apply to our own? So maybe I could go to you first, Peter.
Well, I'll pick up where I left off. I think we have huge lessons to learn from the way that Ukraine is managing its economy in a war. The way that it's very, very what it's done in a way, it's decentralized a lot of the design and delivery of defense solutions in response to real-time battlefield requests. Things get produced, tried out, they work, they don't work. There's a lot of this going on. So I think defense ministries need to become a little bit more relaxed about this and get away from a monolithic model, because you're going to need a lot of this cheap to build, not too much pain if it gets destroyed approach for lots of things like drones in the air, drones on land, and drones underwater. So again, it comes back to agility, speed, risk-taking, and it's no longer these really cumbersome traditional defense contracts, except for things like sort of ships, which you have to plan over multi-annual cycles.
And Chris?
Yeah, I completely agree with Peter. And what we're seeing in Ukraine is truly inspirational in what they've done for the drone market in particular, and how they've really kind of taken in-house a core defense capability, which a lot of our other allies should take note of, because China has restricted materials that are core to that defense capability. But to Peter's overall point, I agree. Speed, agility, and I would add money are going to be central. And what we've seen in the past, going back to 2010, when China did this to Japan and restricted their exports of rare earths over a geopolitical issue, it really has awoken a sleeping giant in the EU and the US. And I expect that we will respond in kind, because we have the ability to move quickly, to deploy capital quickly, to build these capabilities and projects much more quickly than we have in the past. And we have to catch up. We're 25 years behind, but I believe we can do it.
And just quickly, because one last question just popped in the chat box, I just want to give you both a chance to answer. Any unexplored geological regions or deposit types in the EU for yourself, Peter, or just globally for yourself, Chris, that could play a key role in supplying critical raw materials for defence applications? And is the EU or the US government open to exploring or supporting them? Maybe go to yourself first, Peter, and then final words to you, Chris.
So one of the things that was done in the Critical Raw Materials Act is reawaken the whole exploration dimension, which has been a bit sort of sleeping for the last few decades. Many countries have been just resting on old geological work. So basically now there is an obligation for all the countries to establish an exploration program and look for a complete range of things and look deeper than they've looked in the past. And this will be looking for things which we may not consider to be important today, but may become important in decades to come, because you can't have mining projects emerging out of nowhere. They come from decades of prior exploratory work, and they find their moment when they become a real mining asset. So exploration is the starting point, and the risk capital for exploration needs to be put to the service of that work.
Chris?
Yeah, just picking up on the risk capital point, I do think we're going to see a lot more exploration and projects that are coming into the fold in South America and Africa in particular, but that is going to take a lot of capital, and this is where we need additional public support, because if those projects are just in competition with Chinese projects that can manipulate prices, that can get cheap capital and cheap labor, and can operate at lower ESG standards, they won't be economic and they won't get off the ground. And also back to your procurement point, Andrew, I apologize, I jumped right over that into global political competition. I do think it's important that these OEMs wake up to the supply chain problems that they have. I mean, it's relying on China's spot price for some of these materials is going to be the undoing of a lot of automotive folks, as well as the defense sector, which is the focus of the topic today. But 5 and 10-year offtake agreements are what we really do need, but it's not what we're finding right now. So we have to get there if we're going to succeed.
Well, thank you very much for that. I think we're now at time. So I want to thank our distinguished panelists, who are Peter Hanley, Chris Beattie, and of course, Nathan Manthioth, for his contributions in the first segment. To our audience, we encourage you to use these insights as you plan your engagement with both the mining and defence sectors. We hope to see you all at Resourcing tomorrow on the 2nd to the 4th of December. On the 2nd of December, we will have a Chatham House Rule roundtable in person discussing this very topic. So all attendees of this webinar will be sent details on how to sign up and register if you've not already done so. And good day, and thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much.